Greetings. Thanks for joining us today. If you'll hold on just 2 or 3 minutes, we'll get started soon. We're going to give a few more people an opportunity to log in. Um, well, I guess it's not set yet. Well, thank you for joining today. My name is Tim Johnson, and today we're going to talk about my new book, The Mexican-American War Experiences of 12 Civil War Generals. This is the latest book in a series published by LSU Press, the Conflicting Worlds, New Dimensions of the Civil War series. And before I talk about the book, I want to say thank you to Mike Parrish, the editor of the series, for seeing value in this work. I'm really pleased to have this book published by LSU. It's my first book with LSU. And thanks to Rand Dotson and Catherine Kader and Alyssa Plant and others. Thank you, Sonny Rosen, for putting this launch together today. I have been on the history faculty at Lipscomb University in Nashville since 1991. And this is my eighth book. For the past 35 years, I have been researching and writing about the antebellum army, but mostly about the Mexican-American War. And when you study the Mexican-American War, you keep running across these names of lower grade officers like Captain Robert E. Lee, Lieutenant Ulysses S. Grant, Lieutenant Longstreet, Lieutenant Jackson, McClellan, Beauregard, Bragg, on and on and on. All of these names that we're familiar with and associate with the Civil War, but all of these guys were in Mexico. The Mexican War was fought in the 1840s, 1846 to 1848. This is a decade and a half prior to the war with Mexico. Doing a book like this has been on my mind for, goodness, 20 years. But I thought that to pull this off, I really needed the input of Civil War specialists. And so just to tell you how this book sort of got started, in 2021, I reached out to a number of Civil War scholars and asked if they would contribute an essay for a book like this, looking at the Mexican-American War experiences of young officers who would later be famous Civil War generals. And so I was fortunate enough to get a dozen elite scholars from around the country who agreed to write essays for the book. So this book contains 12 essays. Each essay is a chapter. We look at 12 generals, 6 Northern generals, 6 Confederate generals. All 12 of them were graduates of West Point. All of them during the Civil War were either Corps commanders or Army commanders. And so that was the criteria. This is really just a sampling. The intention is to see what kind of impact the Mexican War had on decision making 15 years later. Now, you may be aware that the Mexican-American War is kind of a forgotten war in American history, and a big reason for, well, a couple of reasons. One is it was basically a land grab, and for that reason, it doesn't get a lot of attention by historians. But also, it was so quickly overshadowed by the Civil War, which came just a decade and a half later. But the Mexican-American War was an important war for the Army and for these young officers, these young West Point graduates. I mean, this is the first war in which West Point played an important role in the conduct of the war. This will be the first combat experience for a lot of these young officers. It's also going to be the first time they're going to have experience in an army commanding troops, and especially in another country. I mean, this is the first war that the United States fought outside its own boundaries, the first expeditionary war in American history. And along with that comes a host of problems that the Army will have to deal with related to logistics and supply. And so the American Army that went to Mexico is going through a lot of firsts. First expeditionary war, first time to engage in urban combat, first time to have supply lines that stretch for hundreds of miles. And so this is a real learning opportunity for young officers. What we try to do in this book, in the 12 chapters, each historian, looking at their individual general, interprets that general in his or her own way, and they look to see what lessons they believed their subject learned in Mexico. It might be strategy and tactics. It might be logistics. It might be relationships. How do you deal with other people? I wrote the introduction to the book, and I want to I want to start talking about the book the way that I began the introduction. I began the introduction at Appomattox. That's one of my favorite stories from the Civil War. In April 1865, of course, Lee and Grant met in Appomattox Courthouse. They met for Lee to surrender at the end of the Civil War. They came together. They're in this parlor in the McLean house. They shake hands. There are a few seconds of awkward silence. The first one to speak was General Grant. And the first thing that Grant talked about was Mexico. That's the way he broke the silence. And he told Lee that he remembered him from Mexico, that they had met once during the Mexico City campaign. Well, I think that's a fascinating story. Grant knew that he would find common ground with Lee in talking about something that they had in common. That's what makes the Mexican-American War, I think, important, because so many of these officers who are later going to fight in the Civil War, they had so much in common because they had fought together, served together 15 years earlier in Mexico. Over 300 future Civil War generals served in the Mexican-American War. Now, if you're familiar with the Mexican-American War, you know that there were two principal generals and two principal campaigns. General Zachary Taylor commanded an army. In the first year of the war, they fought 3 or 4 major battles at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma and Monterrey and Buena Vista. But in the second year of the war, there was a second U.S. Army under the command of Winfield Scott, who invaded central Mexico, landed an army at Veracruz, and for 6 months, he marched inland 250 miles and ultimately captured Mexico City in September 1847. The Mexico City campaign, I tell people, it is the most brilliant military campaign that you've never heard of. So what lessons did these young officers learn serving under both Taylor and Scott? You may be aware that Taylor and Scott were very different kinds of generals. They had different personalities. Taylor being a little more laid back, Scott more proper and sort of aloof and condescending. What I'd like to do for just a few minutes is give you 3 or 4 examples. We'll talk about 3 or 4 of the chapters from the book and look at some examples of some Civil War generals. And I'll try to do a quick synopsis of what the author of that particular chapter concluded about their subject. Now, at any time, if a question comes to mind or a comment comes to mind, you will have an opportunity in just a few minutes. You can type in your question and send it, and that will be received and relayed to me, and I'll deal with those in a few minutes. But let me take just a few minutes to give you an overview of what we say about Grant and Lee and McClellan and Johnston in the book. I'm going to do a quick synopsis of each to kind of give you a flavor of how these different historians treated these generals that they're dealing with in each chapter. So first of all, Grant. Tim Smith wrote the essay on Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was a lieutenant in the 4th Infantry, and Grant served under both Taylor and then he was transferred to Scott. So he was under both of these generals. Grant will sort of adopt the laid-back command style of Zachary Taylor, but his strategic thinking came from Scott. Grant was a quartermaster officer, so he was involved in logistics and supply, and he was kind of on the ground, making sure that supplies get from, point A to point B, and that's not always easy. And in Mexico, they were constantly short of wagons. They had a lack of transport. They were rounding up mules wherever they could find them. to transport the Army supplies. This is fundamental, sort of grassroots logistical experience for young Lieutenant Grant. And this was a difficult task. Grant, years later in his memoirs, wrote about this experience, and he said, "I'm not aware of ever having used a profane expletive in my life, but I would have the charity to excuse those who have done so if they were in charge of a train of Mexican pack mules at the time." So this could be difficult sledding sometimes, but these lessons are going to come in handy years later when Grant is commanding an army deep in Mississippi, or learning logistics. That was very important. I think that Grant also learned from Scott's cooperation with the Navy, and Tim Smith points this out in his essay. When Scott landed an army at Veracruz in March of 1847, it was an amphibious landing just outside the city, the largest amphibious landing the United States Army undertook prior to World War II. Grant observed how the Army and the Navy had to cooperate, and how Scott dealt with the Navy in maintaining his supplies and getting all of his troops to Veracruz. Well, as Tim Smith speculates, what lessons did he learn as a lieutenant that will have a bearing on decisions that he would make later when he is in a position of needing to cooperate and have naval assets, for example, at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in 1862, at Shiloh in 1862, or in the Vicksburg campaign in 1863. Those are lessons that Grant learned. And also, Grant participated in several flank attacks during the Mexican War. And so what did he learn in Mexico that would have a bearing on his decisions maneuvering around Vicksburg, or his decisions in the Overland campaign in Virginia in 1864? So these are the high points of what Tim Smith says about Ulysses S. Grant. Let me say a little bit about Robert E. Lee. Joe Glatar, University of North Carolina, wrote the essay on Lee, and he concludes that Lee learned a lot about reconnaissance and maneuver in Mexico. Lee was a captain. Lee was on Winfield Scott's staff. He was Scott's right-hand man. He was the one who charted the path for a couple of crucial flank attacks that Scott's army would make in 1847, at Cerro Gordo in April and at Contreras in August. And so Grant is soaking, Lee is soaking all of this up. I'm really fascinated over the years when I've compared the battles of Cerro Gordo and Chancellorsville, an 1847 battle with an 1863 battle, and how similar they were. And what did Lee learn in this brilliant flank attack at Cerro Gordo in 1847 that would inform his decision-making later? One more thing about Lee that Glatar points out, and that is that he honed his skills as a map maker. That was crucial. When Scott's army got to Puebla, Mexico, this was about 170 miles from the coast, but they're still about 65 or 70 miles from Mexico City. And Scott's army just really hunkered down in Puebla. For 10 weeks, they stayed in Puebla, Mexico. And there's a whole other backstory to that. But while they were encamped there in Puebla, General Scott sent Captain Lee west over to Mexico City to scout out the roads, to observe the enemy movements, to look at topography and terrain and lakes and rivers. And when Lee would come back to Puebla, Scott would quiz him on what he found, what he observed. And then Lee drew a map for Scott for that final advance on Mexico City. if you look at that map that Lee drew in 1847 and compare it to the official map of the same area in the West Point Atlas of American Wars, they are remarkably similar. Lee learned the skills of map making, and I think that's going to translate years later in the Civil War, because Lee had this great innate ability to make war on the map, and all generals could not do that. And what I mean by that is be behind the front lines, looking at a map, gleaning information from reports that are coming in, and deciding what should be done next, and anticipating what the enemy was most likely to do based on terrain and geography and rivers and streams. Lee was a master at that, and he honed those skills in Mexico. Okay, a couple more real quick examples that I want to give you, and then I want to open it up for your comments or questions. Let's take a minute to look at George McClellan, the Northern general during the Civil War. He rose to Army command in the summer of 1861. And then by the fall, he was the commanding general of all Union forces. But in Mexico, McClellan was a lieutenant, and he was a staff officer, and he did a lot of reconnaissance work as well. He was in Scott's Mexico City campaign from start to finish, all 6 months. Let me give you a few bullet points to kind of describe the Mexico City campaign, and you see if you can think of a Civil War campaign that this reminds you of. The Mexico City campaign was basically a strategic turning movement. Scott, by invading central Mexico, shifted the whole front of the war from northern Mexico to central Mexico. Now the objective is going to be to advance on the enemy capital, not from the north, but from the east. And Scott had the advantage of using water transportation and a secure water supply line to get his army down to the East Coast in preparation for his advance on Mexico City. All other operations had to stand down. All available resources were used for Scott's army and for Scott's advance against Mexico City. And the objective, of course, was the enemy capital, which was the political nerve center. Do any of these, does this description remind you of a Civil War campaign? Hopefully it reminds you of the Peninsula Campaign in 1862, when McClellan moved his entire army down to the East Coast by ship and landed east of Richmond and advanced from a very different direction. Tom Cottrell wrote this essay on McClellan. And Cottrell lays all of this out, and he makes a very astute argument, which I completely agree with, and that is that McClellan basically used the Mexico City campaign as his blueprint for his Peninsula campaign in 1862, when he was the commander of the army. Well, quickly, a word about Joseph E. Johnston. Craig Simons, who did a biography of Joe Johnston, Simons wrote the essay on Johnston. This chapter deals not so much with lessons that Johnston learned about strategy and tactics. This is a lesson about relationships and a rank dispute. And you might be aware of the fact that General Joseph E. Johnston in the Confederate Army, General Johnston had a very fractious relationship with President Jefferson Davis during the Civil War. What you might not know is that the seeds to that had been sown years earlier, very quickly. When Johnston went to Mexico, he was a captain. In the spring of 1847, he received a double promotion from captain to lieutenant colonel. In other words, he leapfrogged over the rank of major, went from captain to lieutenant colonel. A few months later, in the fall of 1847, Johnston was promoted from lieutenant colonel to full colonel. So when the war ended, Joe Johnston was a colonel. But Congress did not recognize his double promotion back in the spring of 47. And so they reduced Johnston down to lieutenant colonel. He lost one grade. He protested, he appealed. Congress, the War Department wouldn't hear his appeal. A few years later, when Franklin Pierce was president and Jefferson Davis was the Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis and Joseph E. Johnston had known each other since their days at West Point together in the 1820s. They were both veterans of the Mexican War. And so Johnston believed that Secretary Davis would be sympathetic to his case, but Secretary Davis was not sympathetic, and he refused to hear the case. So Johnston is frustrated once again. Fast forward a few more years. Now Buchanan is president. His Secretary of War was a fellow named John B. Floyd from Virginia. Johnston appealed to Floyd. Floyd heard the case, reversed the decision, and elevated Johnston to his rank of full colonel again. Now, this is after, this is a decade after Johnston had been reduced to lieutenant colonel. Now, it did not hurt Johnston's case that Johnston's brother was married to Secretary Floyd's sister. That sort of thing can't hurt, right? A few months later, now we're in the summer of 1860, Secretary Floyd appointed Joe Johnston as the Quartermaster General of the Army. And with that position comes an automatic promotion to Brigadier General. So when the Civil War began, Joe Johnston was a Brigadier General in the United States Army. He was the highest ranking U.S. Army officer to resign and join the Confederacy. And so naturally, he believed that when the new Confederate Congress issued its a list of commissions and all of the new generals, Joe Johnston believed that he would be the highest ranking general in the new Confederate Army. He was not. He ranked fourth behind Samuel Cooper, Albert Sidney Johnston, and Robert E. Lee. And so now Jefferson Davis is president of the Confederacy, and this is the backstory to that friction between Davis and Johnston during the Civil War. Well, that's just a synopsis of four of the generals and four of the essays written by these four historians. I'll stop there. If we have time, or if you want me to, I'll sort of run down the list and tell you who the other contributors are and the topics of each one of their chapters. But for now, let me stop and see what kind of questions or comments you have.
Thank you. Our first question is, can you speak more about the comparison between Northern and Southern generals during the Mexican War?
Northern and Southern generals during the Mexican War?
So folks who went on to become Northern or Southern
okay.
generals in the Civil War, but when they were in the Mexican-American War.
Well, the young officers that we looked at were all West Point graduates, but there were a lot of volunteer officers, a lot of volunteer units. That's another source of contention in the war itself, whether you were commanded of volunteers or if you were regular Army. And, a couple of the essays in this book address that. For example, Jennifer Murray wrote the essay on George Meade. Lieutenant Meade in Mexico sort of gained a negative appraisal of the media and also of volunteer troops. And that's going to carry over when Meade was an Army commander in the Civil War as well. But these young officers in Mexico are learning the art of maneuver. They're observing and participating in flank attacks that are very reminiscent of flank attacks that you're going to see on numerous battlefields 15 years later. I'm thinking about Taylor's flank attack at Monterey, Scott's flank attack at Cerro Gordo. And a lot of people think that, or will argue that Civil War generals were just conducting battles in the 1860s the way they had learned or had read about the Napoleonic Wars. Some of that is probably true. My belief, though, is that you learn more from experience than you do from textbooks. And so I think much of this sort of Napoleonic flavor of the Civil War is really a result of what these young officers learned in Mexico. Now, I'm not sure if that exactly addresses the question. I don't, but that's my answer.
Thank you. Our next question is from Paul. Question is, did maps exist at this time, or did McClellan have staff familiar with the swampy Chickahominy River area before he selected West Point as his logistics base? Because he seems surprised by the terrain.
Yeah, there were maps, but they might not be recent maps. And in the case of McClellan's Peninsula Campaign, in particular, I think the maps that he had available to him were inaccurate, and that sort of accounts for his surprise at some of the geographic features. Map making was not nearly as sophisticated then as it is now. Some were better at it than others, and so um, the a lot of times when they did have a map to go by, the generals had to really rely more heavily on local guides.
Thank you. Our next question is, would you discuss the changes in the social and political context from the time of the Mexican-American War to the time of the Civil War and what impact that might have had on these generals?
Social and political impact. Well, the Mexican War really shaped and framed what would follow. And some of these officers who went to Mexico were slave owners. Some of them took enslaved people with them as their servants. That, of course, is the overriding and paramount political debate that will follow for a dozen years following the Mexican-American War. And the main reason for that is that there was such a rapid territorial expansion. There was the fear that territorial expansion would go hand in hand with slavery expansion, which is one thing that made the Mexican War so unpopular. By the time you get to the Civil War, at least initially, I think you would find that a majority of these officers, Northern officers, were fighting to preserve the Union. And then, of course, Lincoln. I'm a great fan of Abraham Lincoln, who I think, with some pushing and prodding, but who I think sort of changed the war from 1861 to 1863, changed it from a war to preserve the Union to a war that would also end slavery. These are sort of the political and cultural undercurrents that were running during this time period.
Thank you. Our next question is from John. Question is, what are some things that they learned in Mexico that proved not to be useful in the Civil War?
Well, one thing that they learned and saw executed with great success were bayonet attacks. There was, for example, an assault on a Mexican position at the Battle of Contreras, which was a few miles south of Mexico City, in August 1847. The battle lasted 17 minutes. It was a quick and brilliant success by the Americans. It was a bayonet assault. And these young officers are learning from these experiences. Another successful bayonet attack at Cerro Gordo. Here's the problem. As you may well be aware, during the Mexican War, the standard infantry weapon was a smoothbore musket. The smoothbore had an effective range of maybe 150 yards, not much more than that. And so the killing power was not that great. It was much easier to get up on top of an enemy position with a bayonet than it would be 15 years later when the rifle was the standard infantry weapon, rifles being more accurate, having greater killing power and more distance. I know that there are historians like Earl Hess who have sort of discounted the impact of the rifled musket in the Civil War, but I still think that is a very valid argument. So that's one lesson that they learned in Mexico that would be a great problem for them in the Civil War, because then you have places like just a month ago, I conducted a tour of the Stones River battlefield in Murfreesboro, not too far from here. And on the afternoon of the first day of the battle, there were repeated Confederate attacks on a northern stronghold called the Round Forest. And these were attempted bayonet assaults, but these Confederate soldiers couldn't get close enough to give them the cold steel, as they used to say. So that was an unfortunate lesson learned in Mexico. And one other thing that I'll mention that comes to mind, because in the book, Cicely Zander wrote the essay on Braxton Bragg, and he was an artillery commander, and he was very effective as an artillery commander in Mexico. And in fact, he and some others had so elevated the importance of artillery on the battlefield, mobile artillery, is the flying artillery that maybe you've read about. But Bragg in the Civil War, Zander argues, seemingly forgot his own lessons from Mexico and did not utilize artillery the way he should have on Civil War battlefields.
Thank you. Our next question is about future projects. What are you working on next? Are you thinking of working on something similar, very different? What are your future projects?
Future projects. Yeah, I always sort of have Mexican War projects in the back of my mind, and battle histories of the Mexican-American War. There are a few that have come out in recent years, but there aren't nearly as many of them as we find with Civil War battles. I think a book on the battles just around Mexico City in August and September of 1847 would make a good book, but that's down the road. Current project, what am I working on now? Well, after 35 years of researching and writing mostly about the Mexican-American War and the antebellum army, I really wanted to do something very different. And so currently, I am working on a biography of Robert Neyland. Robert Neyland was the iconic football coach at the University of Tennessee from 1926 to 1952. He coached Tennessee to the first dynasty, really, in the history of the Southeastern Conference. Everyone knows his great football accomplishments, but there's another story to Neyland that most people are completely unaware of. Neyland graduated from West Point in 1916. He attended West Point with Dwight Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, and numerous other future World War II generals. Neyland was in France during World War I as an Army engineer. He would remain in the Army until 1936. He's coaching Tennessee football and carrying out his duties in the Corps of Engineers in Tennessee for a decade before he finally retires. Then in World War II, he's called back to active duty. He served in World War II in the China-Burma India Theater. and served with distinction and ultimately rose to the rank of brigadier general. So sometimes you might hear people, Tennessee fans sometimes will refer to Neyland as the general or General Neyland. And most people who use that title don't even know why they're using it. Well, they're using it because he was a legitimate brigadier general in the United States Army. And no, I'm not a Tennessee fan. I'm an Alabama grad. But I'm writing this not as a fanatical football fan. I'm writing this as an objective historian because the 100th anniversary of Neyland's first year as coach is approaching 2026. And there really hasn't been much written about Neyland, and there needs to be. So that's what I'm working on right now.
Thank you so much. Well, that is our last question, so we can go ahead and say thank you and goodbye to the audience.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for joining us.